place is called Ephesus. And so I thought, you know, what better time to share some of the photos we took, and I'll give a little bit of a background as well, um, based on what our guide told us and what I have in the book that I bought there in Ephesus, and also from my readings, and most importantly from the Bible, right? So I'll take you to a journey to Ephesus, and it's going to be free for you today. So there in that first photo actually is where you enter into this into the city, and you enter into a gate called Gate of Magnesia, which is sort of the upper part of the city, and it's a big city. Ephesus is a big city. So, but first of all, we'll talk about what we'll talk about. So we'll talk about the history and geography of Ephesus. Talk a little bit about the Temple of Artemis and how it's very crucial to the city of Ephesus. And then we'll show you some of the ancient buildings or architecture of Ephesus. And then we'll go into how Christianity blossomed in Ephesus in the first century and how that happened. And then we'll talk about the notable Christians that are connected with this city, and there are quite a few of them, and you'll know all of their names. So, the history of Ephesus. It's an ancient city, so it's been around for a long time. Uh, right now, of course, it's no longer an active city, right? It's been excavated. There is a city a few miles over that is the modern city now that's called Seljuk. But this is the ancient city that was founded by the Ionians, the Greeks, in 10th century BC or 1000 BC. So it became an important hub for trade, culture, and religion because it was a port city. Now, was a port city is very important because Ephesus ceased to be a port city. And this is very peculiar, right? What happened was there was a harbor there, but there's a river also that fed into to this body of water. And over the centuries, this river would carry soil and silt and all that. And slowly the harbor got filled with soil or silt. And so the harbor basically disappeared, right? But during the first century, though, the harbor was still there. The Romans dredged this harbor and made sure that it was still uh, viable, that ships could still come in. So that was the first century, but after that, probably in the 6th century AD and so forth, the harbor totally disappeared. So now, when you go there, there's no longer a harbor, and the sea is about 5 kilometers. The seashore is already 5 kilometers away. So that was one of the reasons why Ephesus ceased to be um, an important or viable city. So other ancient cities, such as Rome, for instance, you can still see that it's active and all that. Istanbul, which was Constantinople, still existent today. But Ephesus, the ancient city of Ephesus, sort of disappeared under the rubble, and then it was only in the 19th century that excavations, revealed the grandeur of this ancient city. So the first settlers there were the Leleges and Carians, I could say. And in the 14th century BC, the Mycenaean Greeks came. And like I said, in 10th of 1000 BC or the 10th century BC, the Ionians came. And in 7th century BC, it was under Persian rule, right? Xerxes and all that. And in 3rd century BC, Alexander the Great came and kicked out the Persians. And so you have that connection with Alexander the Great. So these are some of the buildings that most of them were restored, right? It's not, some of them are not the actual structures, but maybe 50% or so. It being under a lot of soil and vegetation. And so they dug all of these out. And so geography. So Ephesus was a major Greek or Roman city, so a Greek, and then it became Roman under the Roman rule, on the shores of the Aegean Sea, east of Greece, in what is now modern-day Turkey. So it's now part of Turkey. The city was very multicultural due to the significant amount of trading and many roads leading in and out. The Romans especially built a lot of roads, so it made it, it was crucial to the expansion of their empire, right? So one city that benefited from that was Ephesus. So the people of Ephesus took pride in the fact that they were the home of the famous Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And just a side note, in just a few years ago, in 2015, Ephesus was declared as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Right, so this is what you see as you go down that gate that I talked to you about, the Gate of Magnesia, and then past the Roman baths, past some of the other temples. It's a slope, probably 25, 30-degree slope, and it's made of marble. The road is made of marble and can be slippery. And actually, when we were there, a couple of people slipped as they were walking down these marble pathway, right? This is an artist's rendering of what it would have looked like, that same photo that you saw there. So there were colonnades, which are columns, on both sides of this street, and of course it would be colorful. It would have those figures that we will talk about later. And of course it will be filled with people. And again, when we were there were a lot of people, like buses and buses of tourists were visiting this ancient city. So geography again, so if you look at a map of the Mediterranean region, this would be where Ephesus is. That side is Turkey. So we came from Athens. Our boat was from Athens, and we stopped by a few other Greek islands like Santorini and Mykonos, and my wife's favorite, which is Rhodes. I wonder why, right? It bears her name. So, but after Rhodes, I think it was after Rhodes when we went to Ephesus, right? And so in Ephesus, we docked into a port, or the port city of Kusadasi. Kusadasi is a very modern city now. So it's a few minutes from Ephesus, so that's what it was. Okay, now we'll talk about Artemis or Diana, which figures in the history of Ephesus very much. And we read that in the Bible as well, right? So when we talk about Artemis, she is the Greek goddess of the hunt, wild animals, and fertility. So on the left, you have like a statue or marble statue of her, probably in the temple that we'll talk about as well. She would have this image Uh, she, the Roman counterpart of Artemis is called Diana. So when you talk about Artemis, that's Greek, and then Diana is the Roman goddess. So she's the Roman goddess of fertility, right? So if you were Greek at that time and you were having problems conceiving, you wanted a child, you would go to the temple of Artemis and make your sacrifices and hope that you will be blessed with a child, right? So that was their belief. Now, she was a daughter of Zeus and the twin of Apollo. So the Ephesians built a massive temple in her honor. And so this massive temple, which is this one, this is an artist rendering. This is not what you can see in Ephesus right now. But this is a massive temple made in honor of Artemis or Diana. Right? So it was built in 550 BC, and it was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. The reason why is because it was just so magnificent in its construction. So it was bigger than the Parthenon, which is already a big structure, right? Parthenon is in Athens. But this was built before the Parthenon. Like we said, 550 BC. So what did they have here? Well, they had images of Artemis, and they had priests and priestesses that would offer sacrifices, right? People from all around the Mediterranean would come and pay their respects or worship. Yeah, there was a cult of Artemis that was involved here. But today, this massive structure, the only thing that you can see is this. That photo up there, that's what's my photo. One column. One column is left. A marble column. From the massive building made of marble. Like one column would be tons. It would, and you just imagine how they were able to make this without any of the modern equipment that we have, like cranes and all of that. But it only took them 60 years. Some said one of the experts say it took them about 60 years to build this massive structure. So this became the reason why Ephesus became the prime location for the worship of Artemis or Diana. Right? Okay, so now as we go down this marble-lined road, you'll see all these things, right? You would see the Roman baths over there. The Romans highly regarded hygiene, right? It was very important. And the more well-off you were, the better your hygiene was, apparently, right? So they had hot and cold water as well. Hot and cold water, imagine this. So they had aqueducts. These here. This one has a pointer. Made out of clay, I think, or asbestos, or whatever it was. So that's how they managed to have water supply, hot and cold water, like I said, in the Roman baths. And then they had marble columns. So they had great artisans, craftsmen who would craft all these things, and they were very good builders, right? That over on the right-hand side is the Gate of Hadrian. So Ephesus, as a Roman city now in the first century and following, it had a lot of buildings that were dedicated to the different emperors of the Roman times, right? But here's something that's interesting that I would like to point out. One of the places that you can go into is the latrine, or like a washroom, right? Or a toilet. That's on the right-hand side as you walk down. So the latrines were not strictly used for answering the call of nature. In Roman culture, this building would have served the same social purpose as the baths, right? Citizens would stay in the arenas for long periods of time to relax and discuss concerns of the day. So you just imagine, sitting there and then another person comes in. Oh, hi, how's your day going? Well, it's pretty good. Hey. And then they would start talking about business or, whatever. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, they didn't have their magazines or phones. They had to do it verbally and all that. I found that interesting. Um, and again, they had water that flowed, and sewage system. It's incredible. And they had to clean themselves. They had sponge on the end of a stick, right? Or and that actually was, there's a vat or a container of vinegar, right? That kind of disinfected it, and then they would wash it and use it, and so the next person can use it after. I found that interesting. So they were using these latrinas and the baths in order to communicate and all that. Hey, now we have the Trajan fountain. Now this fountain is considered to be one of the three most magnificent fountains of Ephesus. It had two ornamental pools, one in front and one at the rear, and water flowed from a pillar on which rested a colossal statue of Emperor Trajan. An inscription at the base stated that the world rested at the emperor's feet. So yeah, that was a fountain. It's no longer a fountain today, but it's a good place to take a photo apparently. Right there. And so as we continue our walk down this path, we look to our left and we see how they lived. How did the ancient Romans lived? Well, one of the places that we have is the terraced houses. So the photo up on top are the terraced houses, excavation of the terraced houses. Now this is how the wealthy Romans lived, or wealthy Ephesians lived, because like this one, the Ephesus terrace houses, which consisted of 7 housing units. So it looked like houses, actually, like townhouses. They were all connected with each other. Also known as the houses of the rich, were once opulent residences belonging to the upper class of ancient Ephesus. These houses were part of a prosperous neighborhood and showcased the extravagant lifestyle enjoyed by the elite during the Roman era. So if you look at it, this is the actual excavation site. You can tell that they had rooms, and they had mosaics as well in the floors. And apparently, the wealthier you were, the more elaborate the mosaic you would have, because this would have cost a lot of money to put in your house, right? So the person who lived here probably was a wealthy merchant that lived back then. So here they also had running water. They had their bath and all the amenities that you and I, or many of the amenities that you and I enjoy. As we continue to walk down that path, and by the way, the city of Ephesus is so huge that they've only uncovered about 20% of, of it. But fortunately, that 20% is what you would call the downtown of Ephesus, right? The main part of Ephesus. A lot of it is still mountain, and that's probably where the residents, or normal homes would have been built. But it was a huge city, so only 20% of Ephesus had been uncovered up to this point. One of the things that they restored is the Library of Chalcis. It was the third largest library of the ancient world. So we have the library in Alexandria was the biggest, and then the library of Pergamon was the second biggest, and here we have a huge ancient library as well that was built by a son to honor his father. The son's name was Gaius Julius Aquila. Built it in the 1st century as a memorial for his father, Julius Cassius Ptolemaios. And his father was actually buried in the foundations of this library. So this is not only a library, it's also like a monument as well for that individual. That father, that man was no ordinary man. He was a governor of that province of Asia. So not only was he well known, he was also wealthy. So this is now a monument to him, right? So built in the 1st century, burned in the 3rd century, so a lot of the scrolls, it contained up to 12,000 scrolls, right? Ancient manuscripts. A lot of them got lost when it was burned in the 3rd century. But it was restored again in the 4th century and destroyed by an earthquake in the 10th century. Earthquakes happen a lot in the region, and that was one reason why Ephesus kind of disappeared too, was because of a lot of earthquakes. So it's impressive for an ancient structure to be built like this, right? It's a 2-story. This is just the facade, meaning the front of the library. And you could go in and grab a scroll and start reading, and all that. If you were living at that time. Now, near the end of that road, it will lead you to the Great Theater, or the Grand Theater. It was built in the 3rd century BC. It's a huge structure again, and it was a gathering place, a place for entertainment. They had dramas and they had plays in there. They also had gladiator fights in this. And it was also a place where all of the citizens would gather if there was like a meeting, right? Because it was huge enough. Here's another shot of it. And this is what it would have looked like, because the Romans put in that building. And that's where the actors would come in and out of, right? And the amazing thing about this is the acoustics of this theater, because the plays would happen there, and the person who's furthest up can still hear what they were saying, right? And actually, when Rodelia and I were there, actually, she didn't enter the theater. She was tired from walking. But my brother-in-law and I entered as we were taking pictures. A group of tourists, another group of tourists, started singing a hymn. And they weren't singing that loud, but you could hear the songs getting carried in that theater. It was so amazing to hear. I wish I had a video of that, but all I have is a photo of myself. But here, from, this is probably a drone shot that I captured, right? You would see that, you would sense the scale of this grand theater more fully. So it could contain up to 25,000 spectators. So I looked up Rogers Place, how many people can it contain? Any guesses? Our own Coliseum over there? Just shy of 19,000. This place can carry or can accommodate more people than Rogers Place. It's the Grand or Great Theater of Ephesus. And why do we know about this even before it was uncovered? Well, because we read it in our Bible, right? What happened there in the Grand Theater? All right. Well, I guess we can go into how Ephesus and Christianity are tied together. Ephesus holds profound significance for Christians due to its role in the early Christian church. So here are some key reasons. Ephesus is one of the 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelations, right? It's actually the first church that is mentioned in Revelation chapter 2. One of the 7 churches in Asia receiving a message from Jesus Christ. Why don't we go over there? Revelation chapter 2, verses 1 to 7. Somebody want to read that? All right, so it was sort of praising the Ephesian church, but warning the Ephesian church at the same time that their love for Christ should not wane, right? It seems that the Ephesians started very strong, very zealous in the faith, and then they were starting to kind of cool in their love. So it was Jesus here who was talking his message to that church was that they should repent and they should go back to how they were before. So Ephesus is mentioned there. What other things can we say about in relation to the Bible? The book of Ephesians, right? Paul wrote the letter to the Ephesians. When he was in prison in Rome, Paul wrote to the Ephesians, right? That was later on, right? Paul visited Ephesus in his second missionary journey. Briefly, he came with Aquila and Priscilla from Corinth, I believe. So he came with them and a few other companions. Paul usually traveled with some companions. So he had to leave, but he left Aquila and Priscilla, and they continued to evangelize, spread the good news in that city. And so during the third missionary journey of Paul, when he came back, he stayed a little bit longer this time, up to 3 years. So he preached and he spoke against the cult of Artemis, right? So he saw all of these pagan idols. And Paul, knowing Paul from our reading in the scriptures, he would have spoken out against the worship of these idols. And he would have pointed out that the only God that ought to be worshipped is the true God, right? And do you think they would have been happy? Of course, they wouldn't have been happy, right? In fact, we read about the riot in Ephesus, right? And what was the cause of this riot? And remember this huge grand theater, right? Because it figures in this story. So let's go to Acts chapter 19. Most of this chapter is actually Paul in Ephesus. I'm trying to see if we have enough time, but I think we do have enough time. So Paul would have gone to Ephesus as his custom was. Wherever he goes to the synagogue first, right? He would preach or teach or debate with the Jews, right? And some Jews would get converted, right? But some would try to kill him, actually, right? And in this case, this was one of the cases. But if we read Acts chapter 19, verses 23. Let me read this quickly. Starting in verse 23. About that time, there arose a great disturbance about the way. A silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in a lot of business for the craftsmen there. He called them together along with the workers in related trades and said, "You know, my friends, that we receive a good income from this business. And you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus and in practically the whole province of Asia. He says that gods made by human hands are no gods at all. There is danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited, the goddess herself who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia, and the world will be robbed of her divine majesty." That was Demetrius talking, right? He was one of the craftsmen. When they heard this, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" Soon the whole city was in an uproar. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and all of them rushed into the great theater together. Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. Even some of the officials of the province, friends of Paul, sent him a message begging him not to venture into the theater. The assembly was in confusion. Some were shouting one thing, some another. Most of the people did not even know why they were there. The Jews in the crowd pushed Alexander to the front and they shouted instructions to him. He motioned for silence in order to make a defense before the people. But when they realized he was a Jew, they all shouted in unison for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So that was the riot that happened here in Ephesus, and in particular the great theater of Ephesus. Now, number 3 over there, the early Christian community. Ephesus was a hub for early Christianity with a significant Jewish population and a thriving church. So Christianity spread in Ephesus through a combination of factors and key events. So if we look at the initial time of the spread, which was about 50 to 60 AD, so as we mentioned, Apostle Paul visited. He preached in Ephesus in his second and third missionary journeys, and he established a small community of believers. Priscilla and Aquila also had their ministry there. This couple who accompanied Paul continued to teach and strengthen the church. Timothy himself was also in Ephesus. So there were early converts, Jews, God-fearers, and some pagans converted to Christianity. And then in the latter part, Paul's 3-year ministry, as I mentioned, he returned and he established the church, and then evangelism and mission. So Ephesian Christians spread the gospel throughout Asia Minor. So the church in Ephesus was a very mission-minded church, right? So they sent out missionaries from that base, from that city. Did I mention that the population of Ephesus in the first century was about 250,000 people? So it was a huge population there. Probably one of the reasons why Paul went there and all the other missionaries went there, right? So then, question for you. What do you think were the key factors contributing to the growth of the early church in Ephesus? Why do you think the church in Ephesus grew from a small group of people to probably many hundreds or even thousands? Right? Okay. It would draw people, and people from many cultures, right? And many religions as well. What else? Right, not just Paul. Multiple people were preaching the gospel. Paul was there, like I mentioned, Aquila and Priscilla, and Apollos was there, we read in the Bible. And who moved there? John. John, the gospel writer, John was also there. In fact, I'll show you a photo of the Basilica of St. John where they believe he is buried. That's also in Ephesus. So John wrote the Gospel of John. He wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. and he wrote the book of Revelation. Right? John was the one who was here more permanently than even Paul. Paul spent 3 years. John most probably spent over 40 years in Ephesus. And John was the only apostle who wasn't martyred or killed. John died an old man, yeah, from old age, I guess, in Ephesus. So these were some of the key factors contributing to the growth. So it was a good location, right? Strategic location. The presence of a synagogue, which we didn't see. Probably that's one part which hadn't been uncovered yet. But Ephesus had a substantial Jewish population, so it would have had a synagogue. And then we have Greek and Roman influence. The cultural diversity of that city was just probably very amazing. Yeah? So it allowed Christianity to reach a broad audience. And so not only did Paul and all the early followers of Jesus reach the people there, the people who were there also when they traveled, once they were converted to Christianity, they also brought the gospel with them. And that's how Christianity spread all throughout the region. There were miracles and signs as well, reports of healings and exorcisms. Paul, he performed some miracles over there. And then finally, not finally, but one of the factors was the faith of the early Christians, right? Their perseverance through persecution. So Christians' resilience in the face of opposition. So they were still a minority. They were still a minority, and they were persecuted, right? The main religion of Ephesus in the first century was paganism, right? This was the center of the worship or the cult of Artemis, right? And so they had to be strong in their faith. They had to be resilient, and they were. So I mentioned a little bit about John. So he was in Ephesus for quite a long time. By tradition also, we don't read it in the scriptures, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is said to have lived here until her death in 48 AD. Remember at the crucifixion when Jesus said, son, behold your mother, and mother, behold your son, to John? That was the time when Jesus kind of asked John to take care of his mother. And so many believe that when John moved to Ephesus, he would have with him Mary. And so in Ephesus, you would actually there was a church of Mary in there, and there's also a house that they believed where Mary stayed until her, dying, until she died, right? But that's tradition. We're not sure about that. What we're sure of is that Timothy was asked by Paul to stay in Ephesus and to continue to encourage the Christians there. So he was one of the first elders or bishops in that Ephesus church. Aquila and Priscilla, we mentioned that, and Paul, who stayed for 3 years there. So this is the Basilica of St. John that I was talking about. It is it's actually a huge basilica, and the story behind this is that John, in his dying years, asked to be buried. If he were to die, he asked to be buried in a quiet place And so there's a hill here where the ancient Ephesus actually started. It's called Ayu Suluk Hill, actually. Uh, and so that's where he died, and his followers buried him there. And in his tomb, they built a small church, And so centuries after, the Emperor Justinian saw this, and he wanted to honor him, right? And by this time, of course, Christianity was no longer being persecuted. It was now the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so he built this huge basilica with multiple domes as well, on top of the small church that was built. And so when you go there, you find this marble slab, and it says, the tomb of St. John. So that's where he was buried. Okay. And that is the last slide. So do you have any questions? I think we have 1 or 2 minutes for questions. Yes, Brother Simon. No. No, they haven't they haven't uncovered yet. Well, there is, like, aside from the tomb of St. John, which was the site of a small church, there is a church of Mary, but I don't know if that was from the first, probably not from the first century, right? But we do know that in the first century, Christians were actually meeting in homes, right? So they were meeting in homes. So that's probably one reason why there was that, right? But only 20% of Ephesus has been uncovered. So there's still a lot that will be uncovered. They haven't uncovered, to my knowledge, a synagogue, which we read in the Bible, right? That they've uncovered all these ones that we've seen. Yeah. Any other question? No? Okay. So then we have about 10 minutes before we go into our assembly, worship assembly. Yeah. Thank you very much.